So now that we understand the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, we can talk about how both sets of these regimes can use different mechanisms to increase their power or to exert power. One of the most common forms of political power used in an authoritarian or totalitarian regime is coercion. Coercion is to compel behavior by threatening harm. So if I am the leader of an authoritarian regime and I know that there is someone who is rising to challenge me, that I can force them to stop dissenting by either threatening to take their life or throw them in prison or, do bad things to their family, that coercion is a forceful method of compelling change through the use of threats. The second is surveillance, and in the advent of all of the revelations of what the American NSA and CIA are doing, we know that surveillance is everywhere, but surveillance in an authoritarian regime tends to happen on a far broader scale with far less limitations on it than in a democratic system or a democratic regime. The goal of surveillance is to not just monitor everybody, but it's to target opposition, and the goal is to prevent the opposition parties or opposition groups from organizing. A good example of something like this happening in a non-authoritarian system, think of the action of Nixon and the Republicans during the Watergate scandal. They wanted to know what their political opponents were doing so they could respond. In an authoritarian system, surveilling opposition groups gives the state the ability to prepare to shut down that opposition, to break up rallies, to imprison leaders, to squash a movement. That if you see an organizing opposition group pop up, and then all of a sudden the leadership, start disappearing because they're being tracked by the state, it really hurts the ability of the average citizen, the general population, to buy in because they don't know who's next to be targeted by or, disappeared via the means of state power. The third type of control is co-option, and this is trying to target individuals to create a beneficial relationship with them. So if there's somebody who might be joining an opposition group but could be willing to give me, the ruler or my regime, information on that opposition group, then I might be willing to fund them. I might be willing to do things to increase their quality of life. I might be able to surveil them to find out what they need, what kind of pressure points that they have that I could lean on, and use those pressure points to functionally coerce them into doing things, but instead of threat, using the offer of incentives. Co-option is a very excellent tool used by authoritarian regimes because co-option builds alliances. It forces people to buy into the regime only because that makes people dependent on the stability and the survivability of the regime to get everything that they need. Surveillance is a tool that gives authoritarian systems inroads to both coerce and or co-opt individuals, and sometimes you will see an authoritarian system surveil a population and then target an individual to attempt to co-opt them, and if that co-option fails, then they will attempt to coerce them into acting. The last way that control can happen is through the birth of a personality cult, and we kind of talked about this a little bit when we discussed legitimacy, how the establishment of a cult of personality, raising your leader to someone who embodies the spirit of the nation, the poster child of the nation, that if you have hero worship surrounding your leader, then people kind of buy in because they respect the leader regardless of everything else that is happening. Very good example of a cult of personalities. Think about Mao's China. You saw people reading the Little Red Book, the writings, the teachings, the sayings of Mao, and espousing it almost in the similar way that people do with a, Christian gospel. You saw posters of Chairman Mao in all of the kind of public squares, public areas, because they want the leader to be ever present. So a personality cult is elevating the status of the leader to be bigger than the average citizen, to be bigger than the nation, to be bigger than the government, the regime, that individual is the core of everything. And if the goal is to respect, admire, and make that individual beloved, then people will kind of forget about some of maybe the bad things or the questionable things or the repressive things that an authoritarian regime does because they hero worship their leader. Just like we can kind of sort democratic systems into a variety of different types of democracies that would either be a liberal or illiberal form of democracy, we can do the exact same thing when we talk about non-democratic systems. The first type of non-democratic system might be one of the forms that we're the most familiar with, and this could either be personal rule or monarchical rule. Think of one person in power. Think of your classical dictator, your classical king or queen, where the belief is that all roads lead to this person, that this person can make all of the decisions, that the buck stops there, and that there's no clear regime, there are no clear roles of other people to constrain that person's rule. Now, this doesn't mean that the dictator or the monarch is the only person. All of these dictators and monarchs might look for people who support them, people who advise them, but at the end of the day, 100% of the decision-making authority rests in the hands of the king, queen, dictator, etc., etc. This person will tend to find supporters and give them benefits for enforcing the ruler's will. This system of kind of pledging gifts for direct support is called patrimonialism. It's not as extreme as co-option was, like we talked about on the previous slide, because if I'm going to look for people who might be potential future challengers or people who might add legitimacy or lend credence or credibility to my rule, then I will focus on those people. Patrimonialism can also happen, through nepotism, right? That I can buy off my family by giving them reasons to buy into my control. So just like co-option as a mean of expressing power or getting, manipulating people to do things happens, patrimonialism is a good way to build support for the regime because now it forces the hands of a bunch of people who want to put their personal stake in supporting the ruler to make sure the will of the ruler is carried out. The second type of non-democratic rule is military rule, and we're starting to see more states tend towards the use of the military. Military rule tends to happen when states struggle to either have governments that are legitimate or regimes or governments that are perceived as stable. And it can also happen in areas of high levels of violence or public unrest. Those two items don't necessarily have to happen together, but there is a strong correlation between lack of legitimacy and potential violence or lack of public support. So the military will step in to restore order, and maybe they'll turn control back over to the government. Maybe the military will stay in power. And if you think about it, the military and the way the military operates, they have a hierarchical structure, and they function in a way similar to most forms of government where there are, high-ranking officials. There is a food chain. There is a decision-making tree. And if the military has to step in and take control, they already have a lot of the bureaucratic structure of a government to do some of those things. Military rule can be perceived as positive or negative, and one of the 6 countries that we'll study this semester that focuses or has had to use military rule in the past to restore order would be a nation like Nigeria, that after they were released from the bonds of colonialism from the United Kingdom, they tried to instill a liberal democracy. That liberal democracy failed for a variety of reasons, and to restore order, the military had to step in, and the military stayed in control for a while. Eventually, there was pressure on the military to allow the facilitation of elections, to have a second attempt at democracy, and it lasted again for a short period of time, and the military had to step back in. Sometimes military rule can happen through things like a coup. One of the largest allies in the American War on Terror, Pakistan, was led by a military ruler who rose to power through a coup, and that was General Musharraf, who ruled Pakistan for a considerable period of time. We saw an attempted coup and an attempt at instilling military rule in Turkey last semester, where a wing of the military tried to overthrow President Erdogan to instill control, and the reason why the military was successful is because the military didn't act as a mass entity, that there were individuals within the military who supported the incumbent president, and that's why that coup failed. The third is one-party rule, and this tends to be a lot of authoritarian systems now tend to not be a personal form of rule. They tend to be a one-party form of rule when there is a single party that monopolizes politics and either bans explicitly or finds ways to exclude other parties from power. If you think of systems of one-party rule, you can almost, quickly go to a nation like China, where the party might not necessarily be a small minority of the population, but the ruling portion of the party is most definitely a fragment of the population. North Korea would be a system of one-party rule. When you think about post-revolutionary Mexico up through the mid-90s, Mexico functions as a one-party state, although opposition parties weren't explicitly banned from existing. They were effectively neutered to how much power they had. And the incentive to support the party or support the regime is that being a member of the party gives you privileges, it gives you benefits. And if people are willing to benefit from party membership and allowing the party to be in control and allowing the party to rule, then the party will stay in power, and it kind of allows itself to exist into perpetuity, because if the party keeps giving people benefits, then the people will support it. The fourth and final form of non-democratic rule is a theocracy, which is ruled by God, ruled by the church, and this is where faith becomes the foundation of the leaders. If you look at nations throughout the world, we see a small number of theocracies that exist. For example, when we talk about the Islamic Republic of Iran, they are a theocracy, that they have institutions that utilize Sharia law, that they govern themselves based on principles found in the Quran. Nigeria functions as a quasi-theocracy because given the split between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria, there are elements of Sharia courts that exist that allow for rule according to those religious principles. Theocracies can also bleed over into either being a personal system of rule or a one-party system of rule based on the relationship that the religious entities in power have with more traditional political organs like parties or bureaucracies or things like that.